Hey everyone and welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today into climate change. Specifically the idea of tipping points, like those thresholds that once they're crossed, could trigger irreversible changes to the Earth's climate system. So are we like on the verge of one of those shifts? That's what we're going to be talking about today. And get this, one of the sources actually says that the Amazon rainforest, the place that we all think of as like absorbing carbon, is now emitting more in some areas than it's taking in. So joining me today to unpack all this is our expert in all things climate change.
Yeah, it's true. It really highlights how delicate these systems all are. The concept of a climate tipping point is kind of like a domino effect. One change just triggers a cascade of consequences that could lead to rapid and unstoppable shifts.
Okay, so let's like break down this domino effect. The research mentions melting polar ice as an example. Now, I know that contributes to rising sea levels, but how does that trigger that cascade?
Well, as the polar ice melts the Earth's surface, it becomes less reflective. So that means more solar radiation is absorbed, which speeds up the warming and causes even more ice to melt. It's like a feedback loop that just keeps amplifying that initial change.
Oh, wow. So it's not just a linear progression, it's accelerating. The research mentions other potential tipping points besides the ice caps. Like, what are some of the most significant ones?
Well, the Amazon rainforest is a big one. It plays a vital role in regulating global climate. But deforestation and these rising temperatures, they're pushing it toward a tipping point where it could actually shift from a lush rainforest to a dry savanna. And we're already seeing signs of this in some areas, with the rainforest actually emitting more carbon than it's absorbing.
That's really concerning, especially considering how big it is and how important it is. You mentioned savanna. For those of us who aren't botanists, what's like the main difference between a rainforest and a savanna?
So a rainforest is characterized by really dense tall trees and high rainfall. It creates that humid environment that supports tons of biodiversity. But a savanna, on the other hand, is more like a grassland ecosystem with scattered trees and much lower rainfall. So it's a completely different environment with a way lower carbon storage capacity.
So, like, if the Amazon were to transition to a savanna, it wouldn't be able to absorb as much carbon, and that would make the problem even worse. Are there any other tipping points that we should know about?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Another major one is the thawing of permafrost. That permanently frozen ground in the high latitude regions. Well, permafrost contains massive amounts of organic matter, and as it thaws, that matter decomposes, releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere.
And methane is an even more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, right? So that means that the impact of thawing permafrost could be really significant.
Exactly. And like the melting ice caps, it creates another feedback loop. The released greenhouse gases cause further warming, which of course accelerates that thawing process.
Well, these are some pretty scary scenarios. You mentioned that the Amazon is already showing some changes. So how close are we to actually crossing these tipping points?
Well, that's the unsettling part. Some scientists think that certain tipping points could be triggered at just 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is the global average temperature from before humans started really affecting things back in the late 1700s.
And we're already at 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That's getting really close for comfort.
Yeah, it really is. And remember, some scientists think that we might have already crossed certain tipping points, like the shift in the Amazon rainforest's carbon balance. This just shows how urgent the situation is. We're not talking about something way off in the future. These changes are happening right now.
So it's not even a question of if, but when, and maybe how many of these tipping points we end up crossing. Which brings up the big question, what happens if we actually cross those thresholds?
Well, the consequences could be pretty dramatic, and they could be far-reaching and impact everything on the planet and our lives. Just imagine coastal cities completely underwater from rising sea levels. Millions of people would have to move. We could even see extreme weather becoming more common and more intense, with heat waves that make some areas unlivable and droughts that just destroy crops.
On the flip side, the research also mentioned the potential for a mini ice age in some regions because of disruptions in ocean currents. That seems kind of counterintuitive with all this talk of warming. Can you explain how that would happen?
You're talking about the potential disruption of what we call the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, which the Gulf Stream is part of. This system of ocean currents moves warm water from the tropics north, and that helps regulate temperatures in Europe and North America. But as glaciers melt and put fresh water into the North Atlantic, it messes up that balance of salinity and temperature that drives AMOC.
So like the freshwater inflow could basically stop that huge ocean current.
Yeah, basically. And if IMOC weakens or stops completely, it could cause significant cooling in Europe and North America, even as the rest of the world keeps warming.
Wow, so a mini ice age in some areas. And scorching heat in others, and rising sea levels everywhere. These are some pretty bad consequences. It all sounds pretty irreversible.
Yeah, well, some changes might take decades or even centuries to fully play out. The point is that they're really hard to reverse once they start. That's why it's so important to understand these tipping points and do something to stop them.
It really shows how connected all these systems are and how seemingly small changes can trigger huge consequences. This is a lot to think about, but where do we even go from here? Is there any hope at all? What can we do to avoid these potential disasters?
There's totally hope. Remember, these tipping points aren't like guaranteed to happen. We still have time to act and like steer the planet in the right direction towards a more sustainable future.
Well, that's good to hear, but with a problem this huge and these high stakes, where do we even start? What are the things that will actually make a difference?
Well, the biggest thing is to cut down on our greenhouse gas emissions as much as we can. That means getting away from fossil fuels and using renewable energy sources like solar and wind and geothermal.
So it's about changing our whole energy system. But what about things that we can do ourselves? Can the choices we make each day really have an impact?
Yeah, for sure. Individual actions, when a lot of people do them, can create a huge impact. Like, think about how you get around. Could you walk or bike more often? Or take public transportation? What about using less energy at home? Even small changes like using energy-efficient light bulbs or being careful with your heating and cooling can help lower emissions.
Those are great practical tips. The research also talked about the role of forests in fighting climate change. So what can we do to protect and restore those ecosystems?
Protecting the forests we already have is super important. Supporting organizations that are fighting deforestation and pushing for sustainable forestry practices are key. But we also need to focus on planting trees to restore damaged land and increase carbon sequestration.
So it's like a two-pronged approach, preserving what we have and restoring what's been lost. I guess this also connects to the food choices we make and how we farm. Are there specific ways of eating that can help fight climate change?
Oh, definitely. Raising livestock, especially for beef, is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. If we eat less meat, especially red meat, and eat more plant-based foods, we can make a big difference.
That makes sense. It's not about suddenly becoming vegetarian, but just being mindful of our choices and finding a good balance that works for us and the planet. What about the role of technology and innovation in dealing with climate change? Are there any promising things happening in that area?
There are some really exciting developments. For instance, carbon capture and storage technologies are being developed. These can actually grab carbon dioxide emissions from factories and stuff and store them underground. It's still in early stages, but it has the potential to be a big help in reducing carbon levels in the atmosphere.
That sounds super futuristic, like turning pollution into something we can just put away. Are there any other tech solutions on the horizon?
Another area is developing new materials and ways of manufacturing things that use less energy and have a smaller carbon footprint. So like bio-based materials made from renewable resources like plants. Those are starting to be used as alternatives to traditional materials like plastic.
So we need to rethink how we produce and consume things to find ways to keep growing economically without hurting the environment. It sounds like there's a lot we can do, from little things we can do each day to big technological solutions. But what about the role of policy and government action? How can we make the systemic changes that are needed to really tackle climate change?
We need policies that encourage the use of renewable energy, that promote energy efficiency, and put a price on carbon emissions. And we need strong leadership and global cooperation to actually implement these policies.
So it's about creating rules and regulations that support sustainable practices and discourage the bad ones. But how do we get there? How do we get our leaders to take bold action on climate change?
It all starts with getting involved in the political process, voting for people who care about climate action, letting our elected officials know what we think, and supporting organizations that are pushing for strong climate policies.
So it's not just about changing our light bulbs, it's about changing the entire system. It's about using our voices and our votes to demand that our leaders take action.
Exactly. And don't forget, we're not in this alone. There's a growing global movement of people and organizations and even businesses who are pushing for change. This collective momentum is what will ultimately drive the changes we need.
It's really inspiring to think about that we're all part of something bigger, a worldwide effort to build a better future. You mentioned businesses. What role can they play in tackling climate change?
Businesses have a big responsibility, and more of them are stepping up. We're seeing companies commit to reducing their emissions and investing in renewable energy and adopting more sustainable practices all throughout their supply chains.
So it's not just up to governments and individuals. It's about businesses taking responsibility for their own environmental impact and making changes from the inside.
Exactly. And consumers have a part to play here too by supporting businesses that are taking climate action. and choosing products and services that are produced sustainably.
It's about making smart choices and using our purchasing power to encourage change.
That's right. Every decision we make, from what we eat to the clothes we buy to the companies we support, can help build a more sustainable future.
It seems like we have a lot of work to do, but there are also good reasons to be optimistic. We have the knowledge and the tools and the collective will to make a real difference.
Yeah, it really is a team effort, and it's great to see so many people and businesses and organizations all stepping up. But, there are still some roadblocks and pushback.
Right. I think it's good to talk about some of those challenges. What are like the biggest things holding us back from dealing with climate change and avoiding these tipping points?
Well, one of the biggest things is just overcoming inertia. Our societies and economies have been built on fossil fuels for so long, it takes a lot of time and money and willingness to move away from that.
It's like trying to turn a giant ship around. It's not going to happen quickly. What about for us as individuals? What are some of the mental or social barriers that make it hard for people to take action on climate change?
I think sometimes the size of the problem makes people feel helpless or overwhelmed. It's easy to think, well, what difference can I possibly make? And that can lead to apathy or even denial, which are both huge obstacles to actually doing something.
Yeah, that's a real problem. It can feel impossible to even know where to start. How do we overcome that feeling and actually get people to take action?
One way is to focus on the positive impacts that our actions can have, even small ones. Every time you choose to walk instead of driving, or eat a plant-based meal, or support a business that's trying to do the right thing, you're making a difference. And when you tell other people about what you're doing, it can inspire them to do the same. And that creates this ripple effect of positive change.
So it's about shifting from what can I do to what I do actually matters. But what about the bigger picture? Are there any systemic problems that are stopping progress on climate action?
Oh, yeah, definitely. A major one is the focus on short-term gains in our political and economic systems. Dealing with climate change requires long-term planning and investment, but that can be hard when there's so much pressure to get results right now and make quick profits. We need to figure out how to make economic success and environmental sustainability work together so they're not seen as being in conflict with each other.
That makes sense. It's about changing the whole story, showing that spending money on climate action isn't just an expense, but an investment in a more stable and successful future. Speaking of stories, how do we combat all the misinformation and climate denial out there, especially online?
That's a big one. To fight misinformation, we need to do a few things. We need to support fact-checking and promote media literacy so that people can actually judge the information they come across. And social media companies need to take responsibility for the spread of fake or misleading content on their platforms.
So it's about giving people the tools to be critical thinkers, especially in the digital age when misinformation can spread so quickly. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to trusting science and making decisions based on evidence.
Exactly. We have to rely on the best scientific evidence we have to guide our actions and our policies. That means supporting scientific research and communicating the findings to everyone in a clear way, and making sure our leaders are making decisions based on facts, not just their opinions.
All right, so we're wrapping up this deep dive on climate tipping points. What's the one big thing you want our listeners to remember today?
The choices we make today, individually and together, will determine what happens to our planet. The challenges are real, but so are the solutions. By understanding the science and using innovation and working together, we can avoid the worst effects of climate change and create a better world that's sustainable and thriving for us and for the generations to come.
That's a message of hope, and it's one we all need to hear. So to our listeners, we leave you with this question. What actions will you take, no matter how small, to be part of the solution? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into climate tipping points. We hope you learned something and feel inspired. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.